So here we are back again one last time for the G proof, our rigorous mathematical proof that God exists using first-order predicate logic and 5 axioms that no scientist can reasonably deny. We are all the way to video 9 out of 9, the last one, and this is the consequences of the G proof. And we have a website at thegproof.org, as you know, and as you also know, I'm Mark Lawrence Donald Emerson. I'm your teacher, and this is all based on the work of many other great people who are listed here. All right, look at this. Here we are in our map of our videos. Look at all this cyan color. We are almost done. We have covered 8 videos so far, and now we're down here to video 9, the consequences of the G proof. And in this video that we're in right now, we're going to use what we did in videos 6, 7, and 8 when we proved that God exists. All right, so here we go on video 9, and here's an outline of this video. I'll just go over the main points. First, we're going to give a formal definition of God. Then we're going to talk about the impact of the G theorem on science. We're going to talk about atheism. And we're going to talk about the impact of G theory on religion and on psychology and on education, law and government. And then I'm going to close by making some remarks about Wonder Innocence and Upping, Pascal's wager. All right, so here we go with the formal definition of God. This is our first thing here we're going to do, and we're going to use some other things. We're going to use what we did way back in video 1. I gave you an informal definition of God. We're going to use that concept now to formally define God. We're also going to use what we learned in video 5 about the candy cane. The candy cane, which is a proper description, means the. And we're going to use the proof of theorem T3, which we did in video 8, that there exists exactly one thing that is self-causing and omnipotent. Okay, here we go. Definition D4, formally defining God, in our outline there. All right, now, let's talk about formally defining something with a proper description. If something has a property, and that property is unique, then we can create a definition from the property. And what the definition does is it assigns a name to the thing that has that unique property. Okay? So let's use the predicate F to mean blank has the property, whatever the property is. So F means blank has the property. Now this is a 2-step process. A 3-step process. Step 1 is we have to prove that that thing is unique. And we do that by proving the short uniqueness formula, SUF. And that looks like this. In other words, we prove backwards E with the exclamation point. So there exists exactly one X such that Fx. Exactly one thing Fs. That's what this says in our short uniqueness formula, very compactly. All right? And then in step 2, we create a proper description out of that by changing the quantifier to a candy cane. So now we have, this is no longer a statement, this is a thing. It says the thing that has the property, the X such that Fx, the thing that has the property that F represents. All right, and then step 3, we assign a name. We set the name that's being defined equal to this thing here, and I'm making up a name, I'm just going to call it metadata. Okay, so we're going to say metadata equals the X that F's. In other words, the unique thing that F's, we're going to give metadata as the name for that thing. Okay? All right. Now let's make a proper description for God. Okay, now in video 8, we proved the short uniqueness formula, SUF. We proved this. We proved there exists exactly one G, such that SG and OG. There exists a unique phenomenon G, such that G is self-causing and omnipotent, or self-creating, doesn't matter. In other words, there exists a unique self-creating omnipotent phenomenon. That's what we proved in theorem T3 in video 8. Now, that means that's the first step. And that means that now we can make a proper description out of that. We can take this here, which is a statement, and write this. We can say, put the candy cane, the thing, the G, the phenomenon G, that is self-creating and omnipotent, okay, or self-causing, all right? And that means, rewritten another way, the self-creating omnipotent phenomenon. In other words, we got you, God. We got you with this expression right here. That is God. So now what we have to do, we don't have to call it God, though. We need to put a name here. We can pick any name we want for this unique phenomenon. Sometimes we're just going to call it capital G. And so if I want to, I can define capital G this way. See, I'm going to be using capital G now. And remember, I reserved the capital letter G for not being a predicate. And this is why I was saving it for now. Okay, G, capital G, equals the thing which is self-causing and omnipotent. Right there, I've defined G to be that. But, you know, it's nice to have a name that's a word and not just a capital letter. So a one letter capital G is emotionally, fairly neutral emotionally, maybe not perfectly neutral, but it would be nice to have a word name. So let's consider some candidates. What else could we call this thing? Well, here's some possibilities. We could call it Feynman, after Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics for quantum electrodynamics. I actually met him. We could call it Jehovah. We could call it Magdalene, after Mary Magdalene. There's just different ideas. Higgs, we could call it Higgs, after Peter Higgs. We'll talk about Higgs a little bit later in this video. How about Elohim? We could call it Elohim. Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. There's a nice possible candidate we could give as a name. Or Madame Curie, who discovered a great female scientist in the early 20th century. Won a Nobel Prize in Physics and a Nobel Prize in Chemistry. We could call it Supreme Being. We could call it Bhagavan, which is from the Hindu tradition. We could call it Providence, or we could call it God. Now, so we're going to make definition D4. You know, this is my video, so I get to pick the name, and I think that G's omnipotence points to it being what is commonly known as God, and so in this video we're going to call it God, but you know, you could use a different name if you wanted to. So in video 1, way back in video 1, we gave an informal definition, and this is what it was. It said, informal definition of God. God equals the thing that is omnipotent and self-causing. Well, now, we're going to make that a formal definition, just the same way. We're going to say God equals now with the proper description in predicate logic. So God equals, this is a statement in predicate logic, God equals the G such that SG and OG. In other words, the thing which is self-causing and omnipotent. However, we're still going to call it G sometimes. So sometimes I'll call it G, sometimes I'll call it God. All right? I'm not going to call it supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. All right. Okay, so now here we are in our map again. We can see I've made this cyan. We're done with the formal definition, which is actually, I called it D4 because we already have D1, D2, and D3. So now we're going to move on and we'll talk about the impact of G theory on science. Okay, the impact on science, and here we are in our outline. We're going to first talk about version 1 versus version 2, and as I do that, I'm going to begin by reviewing what relative versus absolute mean. In terms of phenomenon. We talked about this in video 6. A relative phenomenon is caused by a different phenomenon. So here we have the orange one is causing the yellow one. And so the yellow one is a relative phenomenon because this yellow phenomenon is caused by something else that's not itself. Okay, a different phenomenon. Now, in my opinion, all time-based phenomena are relative because they don't exist and then they exist. And so something must have caused them other than themselves. That's my opinion anyway. Now, an absolute phenomenon is not caused by a different phenomenon. It's not this. And there are two possibilities. Okay, and here they are. One possibility is that it's self-caused. So the yellow thing here, it's causing itself. We have that loop here. And that is the approach that we're using in version 1, which is the version in these videos. However, in this video now, as I talk about science, I am going to talk about version 2 as well as version 1. The other possibility for an absolute phenomenon is that it's not caused by anything at all. It just exists without a cause. And so version 2 of our theory allows both kinds. It allows both kinds of absolute phenomena. Okay? So as I said, in discussing science, we're going to use versions 1 and 2. Now we're going to compare the two versions. I have a little table here that shows the difference. So version 1 is the green column and version 2 is the yellow column. And let's look at this step by step. What's the purpose of the version? Okay, version 1 is a first level proof that God exists. And version 2 is a second level, more advanced proof that looks deeper into the nature of God, as you'll see in a minute as we go down here. Okay, now let's talk about absolute phenomena. In version 1 interprets absolute phenomena as self-caused, whereas version 2, they can be either self-caused or uncaused, as I just finished saying on the last slide. Now, how is God absolute? In version 1, God is absolute because God is self-caused. And in version 2, God is either self-caused or uncaused. Right? Version 2 doesn't care. In my opinion, that really doesn't matter whether something is self-caused or uncaused. But some people might disagree with me on that. And so in my opinion, it doesn't matter that in version 1 we say God is self-caused. But if you have a problem with that, look at version 2, because then version 2 doesn't even assume that God is self. It doesn't arrive there. It just lets God be either self-caused or uncaused. Now, how is God omnipotent? In version 1, God causes all phenomena. In version 2, God causes all relative phenomena. So that's a weaker version of omnipotence that we do in version 2. But let me explain what happens then. Okay? In version 2, now what are the parts of God? In other words, what's inside of God? Well, in version 1, we don't talk about that. We didn't reach that in version 1 in our proof. But in version 2, what we find out is that absolute phenomena other than God are parts of God. I'll show you a picture of that in just a moment. In other words, the absolute phenomena are like cells in the body of God, if you want to think of this metaphorically. All right? And what is not a part of God? Well, in video 1, we don't talk about that either. We don't consider what's a part of God and what's not. But in version 2, relative phenomena are not parts of God. And so, and then what is God a part of? Well, that's not covered in either version, although in version 1 we talk about H, the big thing from axiom 5 that contains all things that cause anything. We call that H. I don't mean Planck's constant here when I write H. Anyway, for those of you who know what that means. But in any event, it's basically not covered. It's not covered at all in video 2. Okay, now remember that omnipotent only is weaker in version 2. It says causes all relative phenomena. Now let's look at these diagrams of God. Okay, I'm calling this God 1, meaning in version 1. It looks like this. There's God, the pink one, and all the other relative phenomena, or all other phenomena, are out here. And so God, you can see, God's causing itself, because it has this loop around, and also causing everything else, and other things are causing other things as well. So the green and blue ones are various phenomena other than God. Now in version 2, here's God 2. All of these green and blue ones down here are a relative phenomena. God causes them. The absolute phenomena are all inside of God. They're the yellow circles. And you see some of them have little self-causing loops on them. So they're self-causing, and some of them don't, mean they're uncaused. But in any event, all of the yellow ones are absolute. They're not caused by anything different. And we don't know in version 2 whether God is self-caused or not. That's why I have a question mark on the loop there, because God is either self-caused or uncaused. In any event, all of these absolute phenomena are cells, you see, inside of the body of God. And so it's not so important and when we talk about omnipotence, well, did it cause all of its own parts? We don't consider that because they cause themselves, or they just exist by themselves. All right, but God causes definitely all the relative phenomena. Okay, now you can see the difference between version 1 and version 2. Now, let's talk about science. Science is a good interpretation for G-theory. Let's compare mathematics and science for a moment. Mathematics is entirely abstract. Some people think, oh, math is part of science. Well, that's actually true, but science is not a part of math. Mathematics is completely abstract. It does not depend in any way on observable reality. We don't worry about evidence in mathematics at all. All of mathematics can be done in the human mind without making any observations. Just completely close the ears, close the eyes. It can all be done in the mind. But it really helps to have a pencil and paper to write things down. And so mathematics is independent of science. Now, G-theory is pure formal mathematics. It's beyond science. Science, in contrast with mathematics, science is based on observation of the concrete, real, physical world. We have to open our eyes, open our ears, touch things, see what's out there. And scientific theories stand or fall based on what the observable evidence is. If the observable evidence conflicts with the theory, it's not the evidence that has to go, it's the theory that has to go or be changed. And science cannot be done. You can't do science in your mind alone, closing eyes and ears. You have to open your eye. You have to see what's out there. Now, science incorporates and makes use of of mathematics. All of this is mathematics can be pulled into science and used there, and that's very important. In fact, science depends upon mathematics, whereas mathematics does not depend on science. In video 7, I explained that a statement is either an ordinary statement or a tautology or a contradiction. Most statements are ordinary statements. And whether they are true or false depends on the interpretation. For example, P and Q. Is that true or false? Well, it depends on the interpretation. What does P mean? What does Q mean? A tautology is a statement that's always true regardless of the interpretation, like P or not P. That's always true. And a contradiction is a statement that's always false regardless of the interpretation, like P and not P. That's always going to be false. Now, our 5 axioms are each ordinary statements. And that means that none of them is a tautology or a contradiction. So whether they are true or false depends on the interpretation of our undefined terms. Likewise, our theorem T3 that God exists, it's also an ordinary statement. And the same is true of the final theorem in version 2 in the technical papers. So that means that whether the G theorem is true or false depends on the interpretation of our undefined terms. Phenomena is a part of and causes. What are the phenomena and which one is a part of which? In other words, if I take this phenomenon and if I say this phenomenon is a part of that one, that's either true or false. Our interpretation has to tell us, is this true or is it false? Same for the causes relationship. This phenomenon causes that one. Is that true or false? The interpretation has to tell us whether it's true or false. Now, also in video 7, I talked to you about soundness. First order predicate logic is sound. And let me just review what soundness tells us. It says if we have, this diagram here is a repeat from video 7. We have a set of givens here, G1, G2, and G3, and they're being used in multiple proofs. We've got several proofs. Each of these purple or lavender ellipses here is a proof. It's a whole proof. You can see it says prove P3 or P4 or whatever, and then there's a whole box down there which is a whole proof. I haven't put it in there, and then box and finally cancel. In other words, P1, P2, P3, P4, P5, they've each been proven and there's been boxed and canceled. There could be many more. So each of these is a proof which is based on these 3 givens. Now up here in this pink rectangle it says interpretation X. That's an interpretation, and that interpretation is making all of the givens true. In other words, if an interpretation, what soundness tells us, if an interpretation makes all of the givens true, then the interpretation also makes all of the proven statements true. So in other words, P1 is going to be true in interpretation in X. So is P2, P3. All of these proven statements are ordinary statements that might be true or false depending on the interpretation. But under interpretation X, they're true. Why? Because interpretation X makes all the givens true. Okay? And what we did back in video 7 is we used a little tiny trivial interpretation that just had 2 phenomena in it to show that the axioms were consistent. But now we're looking at a bigger picture here. And what we need now is something to provide an interpretation that's that's broader. And we're going to use science for that. Science provides a good interpretation for G theory. Now, an interpretation of our undefined term must answer these 3 questions. It has to tell us what are the phenomena and which of the phenomena is a part of which other ones, okay? We have to know what's a part of what, and which phenomena cause which phenomena. All these questions have to be answered in order for to have an interpretation of our undefined terms. Now, the whole of science provides an interpretation just like that, albeit the information is incomplete because science is incomplete. In any event, what we do in this interpretation using all of science is we take the phenomena are all observations that are admitted by science. Everything that scientists all over the world, over the history of science, have observed. And okay, whatever can be observed by scientists or has been observed by science, those are phenomena. Okay? And then scientific theories, together with the universal constants, I'll talk about the universal constants in a few minutes, put those together, and those together explain, number 1, how the phenomena are structured. Now, what is inside of what is a part of what? That's structure. And number 2, which phenomena cause which phenomena. For instance, we talked in video 6 about the falling of the apples from a tree, and I talked about, well, what causes the apples to fall from a tree. We talked about an aggregate phenomena that had Newton's 3 laws of motion and 1 law of gravity. That was one. And then we had the mass of the earth and the mass of the apples and the breaking of the stems. That's the whole way that science would explain what causes the apple to fall using the theory, see? Okay, so we rely on science we let science provide our interpretation of the 3 undefined terms. And oh, by the way, in version 1, as I've said before, I don't think I said it in this video, version 2 is available in the technical papers, which you can download from our website. What I've covered in videos 1 through 8 in these videos is version 1, and in this video 9 I'm putting version 2 and 1 together just to address these questions of science. And to my knowledge, the axioms in version 1 and also the axioms in version 2 are all true under this interpretation that science gives. In other words, using everything that science tells us, I believe that the axioms are all true. Thus, based on soundness, that means our theorem T3 is also true under the interpretation given by science. Also, the final theorem in version 2 is true because all of its axioms are true under the interpretation given by science. Now let me clarify that with some diagrams. So what we're doing here is we're using first order predicate logic to prove theorems T1, T2, and T3 from our axioms. This diagram shows it. Here I have in the yellow ellipse axioms A1 through A5. There are givens. And then we proved in video 8 theorem T1 and T2 and T3. They're all shown here, boxed and canceled. All right? And what we just said was that the interpretation made by science, given by science, here's science in the pink box, the interpretation given by science makes all of our axioms true. That's what we just talked about. All right? And that means that by soundness, science also makes each of our theorems that we've proven true. T1 and T2 and T3. T3 says that God exists. This is true under the interpretation given by science. All right, now let's talk about the falsifiability of G-theory. A scientific theory stands only as long as observable evidence is not found that refutes it. Now, a scientific theory is considered potentially falsifiable if there exists some conceivable observation, not one observation that's already been made, that what we can conceive that what we might make an observation, and not only that it's conceivable, but it would be practical to make. It's not like saying, well, we're going to travel to the Andromeda galaxy and we're going to take some pictures. Well, that's not really conceivable, at least not in our time frame here. But it would be practical to make, and that would, if observed, show the theory to be false. Now, potential falsibility is a good thing. Like, theories that are not potentially falsifiable are generally considered inferior and subject to skepticism. Well, there's no way to prove it. There's no way to show that it's wrong, and that generally theories of that nature are a little bit wishy-washy, and so it's like, I don't have any way to show this is wrong. So, but on the other hand, I don't believe it's right. So falsifiability or potential falsifiability strengthens a theory. Now, G-theory is potentially falsifiable as follows. All we have to do is observe any new facts and or create any credible new scientific theory where any of the axioms comes out false. For instance, if we figured out a way to set up 3 dominoes so that the first one knocks down the second one, and the second one knocks down the third one, but knocking down the first one does not cause the third one to fall down. That would violate our transitivity axiom. If it were possible to figure out a way to set dominoes up, and maybe it's possible, I mean, someone's going to figure out an ingenious way to contrive the dominoes, okay? That would make axiom A2 false. I don't know how to do that with dominoes. I don't think anybody's going to figure it out, but this is a path to falsifiability. And this is not the only one. There are millions of different possibilities. All you have to do is find some facts that make one of the axioms false. All right. And lastly now here, in talking about science, we're going to talk about a new mathematically based cosmology. All right? By letting all of science provide the interpretation for our axioms, G-theory actually provides a new cosmology for understanding science. G-theory shows that, based on existing science, a unique, absolute, omnipotent phenomenon exists which underlies all of science and is the cause of all relative phenomena. So it's like it provides a basis to sit underneath science and say, see, this is what science rests on. In other words, what we've done, see, we've used mathematics. I talked about this in video 1. By using formal mathematics, we've created a window using formal mathematics, and we can look through that window. We can see God. We can see God just by looking at the proof. What we did in video 8, what we did in all the videos, understanding all the predicate logic, understanding the undefined terms and the definitions and the axioms and actually the proof. It's like, there it is. We can see it. And so, once we can see that and we can see, oh, well, this is underneath science. This is underneath science. It isn't mathematics. Mathematics is the bedrock on which science rests, and this is within mathematics. And so it's a new cosmology. Now, has science yet identified this phenomenon that we can see through this window? In other words, has science yet identified God? We've identified it mathematically, but can science identify it? Now, if so, then G-theory shows that whatever science might identify would have to be an absolute phenomenon, because we've proven that God is absolute. In other words, it has to either be self-caused or uncaused. Now, I know in version 1 we interpret it as self-caused, but in version 2 we relax that. We did either self-caused or uncaused. In any event, can't be caused by something else. Also, it would have to exist beyond time, because, at least in my opinion, anything that is time-based is a relative phenomenon, because it doesn't exist, and then it exists, and then maybe it doesn't exist. Well, something caused it to begin to exist, something caused it to stop existing. It would also have to be omnipotent and unique, because we've proven that G is omnipotent and unique. So let's look at some candidates. What are some of the things that science today might offer us as candidates for God? Scientific candidates for God. What about the entire universe? Well, that's an interesting idea. Is the whole universe God? The problem, I say no. No. Because the universe has a lot of parts. It has a lot of galaxies and stars and planets. It's got me standing here making these videos. It's got you watching these videos, and all of us are changing. All those stars are moving. The supernovae are exploding. Life is evolving. And so these parts of the universe are changing. And if the parts of the universe are changing, that means the universe itself is changing. So the universe is not absolute. It's relative. Another possibility, the collection of all the best current theories of physics, including general relativity and the standard model of particles. Now, you might not know what those are, but those are very big-time major theories that are at the forefront of science. General relativity was developed by Albert Einstein approximately 100 years ago, and the standard model of particles is developed over the last 40 years. Not likely. These theories are not omnipotent. They fail to explain many relative phenomena. For instance, dark matter and dark energy in the universe. It's believed that there is a significant amount of things called dark energy and dark matter out there that are not explained by these theories. Also, these theories do not explain what the scientists experience is in their own consciousness. What does the scientists experience in their consciousness when they're creating these theories? What was going on in Einstein's consciousness when he created general relativity? What was going on in Peter Higgs's consciousness and his colleagues when they conceived of the Higgs field and then eventually predicted the Higgs boson? What's happening in your consciousness right now as you're watching these videos? I don't think that general relativity and the standard model of particle physics explains those things. Moreover, the history of science repeatedly shows that new discoveries get made that cannot be explained by existing theories. And that propels science forward and causes new theories to get developed. And what that means is that the state of scientific understanding is changing. It changes from time to time. And scientists are busy engaged in the process of changing that. And therefore, the state of scientific understanding is not absolute. And there's no evidence that this trend has suddenly stopped or is likely to stop. So I don't think that science, that our scientific theories, those are not good candidates for God. Or collectively, together is not a good candidate for God. Okay? What about the collection of universal physical constants? Now, there are quite a few of these. I've just got a few of them listed here. The speed of light, the electron charge, the Planck constant, the fine structure constant. Fine structure constant is even more interesting because it doesn't have any dimensions. There's a long list of these. And these are fascinating things. I'm going to talk about them a little bit more later, but they are integral to the theories. The scientific theories use these constants. And they appear in the equations that define these theories. And they get measured, and there's a whole bunch of science involved. It's fascinating stuff. Well, I say not likely, because the constants aren't God, because they're meaningless outside the outside the context of the theories that reference them. And the theories are not omnipotent. In fact, the collection of theories, the state of theoretical understanding is evolving. And so what these constants mean may change. And we don't know, we have to see. But I don't think that makes them good candidates for God as a collection. What about the Higgs boson? There's a lot of publicity. While these videos were being created in the process, back in July of 2012, when I was at the beginning of writing all these slides at the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland and France, there was an event that happened, and they believed that they had detected the Higgs boson, and the media called this the God particle. And then in October of 2012, there was more evidence, and then just recently in March of 2012, we're in the middle of, is between the shooting of some of these videos, I can't remember which one, it was between 5 and 6 or something like that, the announcement came out that it's pretty much confirmed that the Higgs boson was detected. Exciting news. Now, is the Higgs boson God? Well, no. Higgs bosons are created and destroyed, so they're not absolute. Also, there are many of them, so they're not unique. Besides, the name God particle was just a media stunt done to sensationalize a book. A lot of physicists don't like that name. Okay, so let's talk about new directions for science. In my opinion, G theory can provide new inspiration for the development of science. Can G be located or identified by the methods of experimental and theoretical physics? I don't know. I have doubts about that. Or will new methods of investigation that go beyond theoretical and experimental physics as we know it today be needed to identify G? Most, perhaps all, of science is limited to investigating relative phenomena. And this limitation, I think, needs to be acknowledged and then transcended in order to detect G. Now, I anticipate that further mathematical development of G theory is going to shed more light on the nature of G, independent of science, just working in mathematics. New undefined terms need to be added, such as maybe, I don't know, consciousness, knowledge, goodness, love, I don't know. And new axioms would need to be added. And so, in my opinion, science should now develop in accordance with the existence of G. All right. So here we are in our map. We're done with science. Now we're going to move on and talk about atheism. Challenge to atheism. Okay, here we are in our outline. Now, and there's the atheists. Some atheists may wish to reject the G-proof, either version 1 or version 2. Perhaps because it conflicts with their belief that God does not exist, and some agnostics might not like it either. They actually have two choices. They can attempt to rationally reject the G-proof, or they can irrationally reject it. All right, so let's talk about rational strategies for attempting to reject it. Now, there are basically 4 different ways to reject the G-proof rationally, or to attempt to reject it. The first strategy is to reject first-order predicate logic. And the second possibility is to reject one of the 3 undefined terms as having no meaning or no meaningful interpretation, or somehow incompatible with one another. The third strategy is to reject one of the axioms. And the fourth strategy is to reject the consistency of the axioms. And that's it. There are really no other rational ways to reject the G-proof. However, each of these has a problem, and some of them actually require supporting something highly unlikely, which may violate what's called Occam's razor. Now, strategy 1 is to reject first-order predicate logic. That's like rejecting arithmetic, or rejecting geometry, or rejecting most of the significant results in mathematics over the past century. Since its development in between 1879 and 1910, first-order predicate logic has been the bedrock of modern mathematics, which in turn is the bedrock of science. Science rests on mathematics, and mathematics rests on predicate logic. So this rejection is nothing short of absurd. Now, strategy 2 is to reject any of our 3 undefined terms. Phenomenon is a part of, and causes. But which one? And why? These 3 terms, as we presented them in video 6, they really do reflect reality as it's currently known to science. In my opinion, such a rejection would require finding a situation where one of the 3 undefined terms, is somehow irrelevant or meaningless. But this is difficult to do because everything ever observed, at least in my opinion, can be seen as a phenomenon that is related to other phenomena by the part of relationship and by the cause relationship. And strategy 3 is to reject one of the axioms, either in version 1 or in version 2. But which ones? In videos 6 and 7, we explained why science cannot reasonably deny any of axioms A1 through A5. And the version 2 technical paper likewise justifies its axioms. In version 2, we actually make some changes to the axioms, but we still get the result that God exists. And all these axioms make good sense. They're consistent, as far as I can see, with all scientific observations made thus far. So in my opinion, such a rejection is going to require finding a situation where it makes no sense for one of the axioms to be true. This is difficult. And strategy 4 is to reject the consistency of the axioms. Well, first-order predicate logic has the property of soundness, as we've said, which means if an interpretation exists, any interpretation, that satisfies the axioms and makes them all true, then they're consistent. And we showed that a tiny interpretation, which is 2 phenomena, makes all 5 of the axioms in version 1 true, which means they are consistent. We can actually formally prove the consistency, but that requires more advanced mathematics. We can do the same thing for the axioms in version 2. And so rejection of the consistency is going to require rejecting well-established concepts in mathematical logic. What about parallel universes? You know, one thing that inspires awe in scientists, and including atheists, and certainly in people who believe in God too, is the following fact. Many of the universal constants, we've talked about some of these, speed of light, proton mass, fine structure constant, some of these have values. They have values that seem to be perfectly tuned to support life. In fact, it can be calculated with just a small percentage change in any one of these constants, and some of them are more sensitive to this than others. With a small change in some of these constants, the world as we know it would collapse, the sun would collapse, life would be impossible. So how is that? How is it that these many, many constants are so perfectly tuned to make life possible? Well, one explanation is that these constants were tuned by God. God tuned them. Now, atheists reject this. They have done a huge amount of work to try to come up with an explanation for this fine-tuning of all the constants that does not involve God. And here is one of the standard ones that it's very popular today. It's called parallel universes, sometimes called multiverse. And what the idea is that the physical constants are randomly different in each universe. There are many universes, and there's a dice throw in each universe that has its own random version of the physical constants. And it just so happens that by chance, by some random cosmic dice throw, in our universe, this one right here, it came out right to support life. Okay, that's the idea of this multiple universes, parallel universes theory. Now, G theory is better. Come on. In deciding between all alternative theories, we need to apply a principle called Occam's razor. Occam's razor says this: other things being equal, a simpler explanation is better than a more complicated one, as long as everything else is equal. Now, our theory is very simple. It's rooted in widely observed evidence of phenomenon that adhere to our axioms. And it explains, in part, the physical constant values. How are they tuned? G caused them to be that way. There is an underlying cause, which is G, or God, that made them come out the way they are. All right? Parallel universe theory, well, it's extremely complex. It's difficult to grasp. What do you mean another universe? I can barely grasp the existing universe, you know? Not only that, there is zero evidence. Zero. Nobody has ever observed anything in another universe. This is very way out there and bizarre, but our theory is very simple, and it gives a better explanation. So by Occam's razor, G theory wins by a mile over multiple universes, at least in my opinion. All right, so now let's look at irrational ways of rejecting G theory. There are many irrational strategies. We'll take a quick look at a few of them. Number one is to avoid facing the truth. Number two is to reject the G proof based on things unrelated to it. And the third one is to punish the messenger. Now, reliance on any of these strategies is unscientific and irrational. So strategy one, avoid facing the truth. Here's some possibilities. Label the G proof as invalid because it proves something that one does not want proven. Bury one's head in the sand, you know, the ostrich trick. Go into psychological denial. You know? Pretend these videos and technical papers don't exist. No, they don't exist. Refuse to look carefully at them. No, 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 no. You could use, refuse to believe the result even though it's proven. Use drugs or alcohol and escape. Escape from the truth. Or form a support group of peers, a peer group, to collectively avoid facing the truth. Okay, we're not looking at it. Now, people actually do these things. Strategy two is to reject it based on things unrelated to it. Things about, for instance, here's a possibility, things about people on whose great work the G proof depends, but that are unrelated to the proof. For instance, Gottlob Frege, who he died in 1925, but he was anti-Semitic, and he actually supported Adolf Hitler. Therefore, predicate logic falls because Gottlob Frege supported Hitler. Wow, that was before Hitler became really bad. So Frege was dead before the real atrocities started happening. Also, Professor Richard Montague, you know, we're doing these box and cancel proofs based on Kalish and Montague. Professor Montague was gay. Not only that, he was murdered by a male trick he picked up from the street. And that was back in 1971. His murder is still a cold case that's been unsolved by police. Aha, there's the reason to reject Kalish and Montague's proof system. Come on. Or you could reject the proof based on things about me that have nothing to do with the proof. You know, I've written a lot of things, I've put up a lot of website and websites, and some people have read my writings. One of my websites went viral, and there's a lot of very negative, ridiculing, nasty things written about me. There's all over the internet, and you can go look that up and find out about all that stuff. You know, stuff written by people who have never met me, who completely misconstrued what I wrote. But well, there's a reason. Also, you might read some people who have misconstrued things that I've written about sex and prostitution. You know, I actually believe that prostitution can be a good thing. I have non-standard beliefs about prostitution and about sex, but that has nothing to do with the G-proof. What I think about sex and prostitution has nothing to do with it. Also, you could read about legal battles. I've had a lot of legal battles with one particular person. All this stuff about me personally has nothing to do with the G-proof. I'm just a teacher. I'm just teaching it to you. And I can teach just as well regardless of any of this stuff. All right. Next strategy, punish the messenger. You know, the powers that be in the scientific establishment largely reject the existence of God. And I'm talking about not scientists in general, but the ones in power who control the research money and grants and corporate funding, people who control the faculty appointments and tenure at major universities, especially in the scientific departments, the people who control the scientific journals, especially the major ones, who gets published, who doesn't. You know, to punish the messenger, these powerful people, they could actually convene an inquisition. And they could force me to come and appear before that inquisition and answer charges of heresy against the scientific establishment. And then I could present my defense, and my defense could be completely ignored, and then they could find me guilty of heresy and punish me for making these videos, you know? And that's a strategy for irrationally rejecting them. It's been done historically. But I hope that doesn't happen. But we'll see. All right, some interesting questions about atheism. You know, does rejecting the existence of God, in the light of our G-proof, where we've proven God exists, does that require taking the non-existence of God now on faith? In other words, will atheism now become faith-based? In my opinion, the answer is yes. Or will believing that there is no God become like believing that the earth is flat and motionless? Or believing that matter is continuous and has no atoms? In my opinion, the answer is yes. Okay, so that takes care of our challenge to atheism. Now let's move on and talk about the impact of G-theory on religion and psychology and education and law and government. So we'll start with religion. So here we are in our outline, religion, and we're going to begin with the problem of evil. What is the problem of evil? Theologians have long been perplexed by this. Here it is. If God is omnipotent and omniscient, meaning He knows everything, and good, and loves us, then why does evil exist? You know, how can a loving God, who has the knowledge and the power to prevent evil, permit the horrible evils that we see in this world? No good and loving parent with the power to prevent harm to his child or her child would allow that child to be tortured or killed. No good and loving leader of a society with the power to prevent genocide would permit genocide to occur. Permitting such evil is the antithesis of goodness and love. This is a legitimate argument that atheists use against the existence of God. Now, what's happened here with the G-proof is we've actually partially resolved the problem of evil. God does exist. God does have the power to prevent evil. But what we have not proven whether God is good or loving. What we have proven is that if God is good and loving, as we understand those words, then it must be the case that God lets evil exist. In fact, God causes evil because God causes everything. Now, why? We do not know why this is so. Is this a paradox? if God is good and loving. We haven't proved God is good and loving, but let's assume for a moment the traditional concept of God, that is God is good and loving. Is this a paradox? In my opinion, we don't yet know, even if it's a paradox. Let me explain that. But there are many other things that we don't yet know. Like precisely when will a particular radioactive atom decay, go and spit out an alpha particle, a beta particle or something. The best we can do is measure half-life. Now, here's my observation on good versus evil. And this would point to where research may go, mathematical research, to develop the theory further. I think in order to define good versus evil, make a formal definition of it, two factors should be considered and included in the definition. One is the concept of joy versus misery, and another one is time frame, short-term versus long-term. In my opinion, an act is good if it creates long-term joy. Now, this might require short-term misery. For example, if you have a splinter in your finger, you need to get the splinter out, it hurts. Well, digging it out with the needle hurts even more. Ouch, 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 as we're digging out the splinter, but then we get it out, and then that allows it to heal. That brings a long-term joy. If you don't dig it out, then it will get infected and become much worse. And in my opinion, an act is evil if it creates long-term misery. Now, it might at first create short-term joy, but it's not worth it. And the example is alcohol abuse. When you drink a lot of alcohol or use drugs, makes someone very happy for a while, and then afterwards it creates all sorts of problems that become long-term misery. And this concept of good and evil, it was inspired by one of my teachers, someone I respect very much, named Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. That's where I got the inspiration for this. I actually heard it from him. I think it's a good idea. In other words, our theory might be extended by taking joy and time frame and perhaps misery as new undefined terms and defining evil and good from them. Now, here are my thoughts on whether or not the problem of evil is a paradox. Okay, there's a question here. What time scale distinguishes good from evil? In other words, what is the short term and what's the long term? I think that's very relevant to understanding the distinction between good and evil. I don't know the answer to that question. In my opinion, resolving the problem of evil crucially depends on answering this question. In other words, what is God's time scale? Now, whether the problem of evil is a paradox might additionally depend on whether we exist eternally. We certainly don't exist eternally in our physical bodies. Whether reincarnation is true, whether the principle of karma is true, whether our deep beliefs attract evil, whether we and this universe are ultimately headed for unfathomable joy. These are interesting ideas that come from spiritual traditions and religious traditions. Some of them are Eastern, some of them are Western as well. You know, it's such possibilities could lead, if these kinds of ideas and this idea up here might potentially lead to a clean resolution of the problem of evil. In other words, these horrible things are happening, but they're in God's short time and in God's long time, which might span reincarnation and multiple lifetimes. Very good things are happening in the long term. I don't know. All right, here we are in our outline. Let's move on with religion to the next point about human free will. Do humans have free will? Well, let's consider a woman named Rebecca. Her physical body, her mind, her emotions, her life experiences, all that together constitute a phenomenon with many parts. And let's call this the Rebecca phenomenon. We'll call it R. Now, supposing she receives invitations from two men to go out on a date on the same night. One is from Sam and the other is from Tim. Now, she has to make a choice. Now, rejecting Sam, she chooses Tim and goes out with him that night. Now, Rebecca's choice is, and going on the date with Tim, comprise a phenomenon. Let's call this the Tim choice phenomenon. We'll call it T. Now, What caused T? It appears, using our predicate logic notation here, that R caused T. In other words, Rebecca's choice, the Rebecca phenomenon, Rebecca caused the choice to get made to go with Tim. Rebecca herself caused the choice to happen. She made the choice. But we have proven that G made the choice. We have proven that G caused T. We've also proven that G causes R. So looking at this diagrammatically here, here's God, the pink circle, and here's Rebecca, the yellow circle in the middle there, and then we've got an invitation from Sam up here on the top, and a choice to date Tim and their date down here. Well, you see, God's causing all these things. And Rebecca caused her choice to get made, okay? But God also caused that choice to be made. So even though Rebecca chose Tim, quote unquote, God caused her to choose Tim. Her choice was not her own, but God's. And so, you see, in my opinion, humans do not have free will. Choice is actually an illusion, which is what I'm saying here. She has an illusion that she's made a choice to date Tim. Since choices are merely illusions, that means free will does not exist. All choices are made by God. We could call this God's will. Now, I'm going to give you my opinions about choice. You know, choice, quote unquote, is extremely popular today. It's commonly asserted that choice is somehow empowering. Well, I disagree with that. In my opinion, so long as we are not consciously aware that God is actually making the choices, we experience this illusion of free will, of making our own choices. And in this state, we should strive to make good choices. It's irresponsible and wrongful to do evil things and then give an excuse like, oh, God made me do it, or Satan made me do it. No, that's not a good thing. Now, in my opinion also, when we wake up and become consciously aware that God is the actor, God is doing everything, God is making all the choices, and we consciously surrender to that, we surrender to God, then in my opinion, we get better results. I think that focusing on choice, quote unquote, as being empowering somehow is a distraction. I think it's better to get in tune with God. That's my own personal spiritual philosophy. Now let's talk about the impact of G theory on psychology. Here we are in our outline. Are God reports delusional? You know, there's a significant difference between psychology on the one hand and all the other sciences on the other hand, like physics and astronomy, chemistry, biology. And here's the difference. In the other sciences, things like galaxies and atoms and cells and animals, they don't talk about God. They don't speak about God. But in psychology, humans do talk about God, and they report profound experiences in connection with God. This is a very important distinction. Now, mainstream psychology today listens, but it often filters. Psychologists and psychotherapists and psychiatrists, they will take some things very serious, like if the client, the patient, talks about tangible daily activities. This is what I did today. They talk about fear. They talk about anger. Oh, I'm so angry. They talk about jealousy. Sexual fantasy. There's a big one. You talk about sexual fantasy on a psychiatrist's couch. Oh, the psychiatrist is going to be making lots of notes. Or you talk about violence. Lots of notes on that one. But not other things, like if the client reports experiences about God, that's another matter. And you know, there are a lot of atheist psychologists and psychiatrists out there, psychotherapists, who refuse to take such reports seriously because they don't believe in God. And instead they label them as delusions. Oh, this guy is deluding about God. But we have proven God exists. And so reports about God should not be dismissed without serious consideration. It's possible they're deluding, but they might not be deluding. Now let's talk about wiring versus God. You know, mainstream psychology is based to a great extent on a concept of an analogy between human thought, the human thought process, and the running of a computer program where The human mind is a software-like phenomenon. Although what I'm thinking, okay, this is software-like phenomenon that's running on the hardware of the human brain. And that the brain is wired in a particular way that causes the software to run in a particular way and creates, the mental phenomenon that happened. And God is not included in that model. This whole concept here God doesn't appear anywhere in the concept. Now the G-proof, combined with other evidence, challenges this concept here, this whole wiring concept, challenges it at its core. The G-proof establishes that all mental phenomena, all thought phenomena, are caused not merely by wiring, but they're caused by God. Experiences reported by humans in high states of consciousness, and this is very seldom investigated by psychologists, they just look at ordinary people normally, suggest that the human mind is intimately connected with God. So now let's talk about the atheist bias, what I believe is an atheist bias in psychotherapy. Many of the key concepts in mainstream psychotherapy are documented in what's called the DSM. It's a big fat book. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, published by the American Psychiatric Association. The DSM has a strong atheist bias in that it completely fails to account for God playing any role in any mental phenomenon. And yet, spiritual practitioners report that many mental disorders can actually be healed by the patient becoming more aware of the cause of his or her thoughts, which is God. Now, we have now proven that God exists and causes all thought. So why are these spiritual diagnostic paradigms systematically excluded from the DSM? In my opinion, mainstream psychology should now develop in accordance with the existence of G. Now let's talk about the impact on education. Here we are in our outline. In public education today, mathematics and science are emphasized. That is good, in my opinion. I love to teach math. I think it's very important. I think that in fact, in my opinion, it's very poorly taught. And the educational system does a very inadequate job, in my view, of teaching these subjects. However, in the United States today, and in many other countries too, God has been largely removed from public education based on the separation of church and state, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. The view that science is correct and does not involve God, while religion is incorrect in part because it involves God. And that's the basis of this exclusion of God. Science is right, we don't need God, so keep God out of education because of separation of church and state. Well, what's the impact of G-theory on all this? The G-proof challenges all this. God is squarely in the domain of mathematics and science. Students worldwide should be taught geometry proofs, they should be taught sentential and predicate logic, and they should be taught the G-proof. Students who study and learn these things will develop deeper thinking skills. They'll be less vulnerable to corrupt influences and false propaganda. And in my opinion, this will contribute to a more enlightened society and to bring a reduction of human suffering globally. In my opinion, public education should now develop in accordance with the existence of G. All right, let's move on now to law and government. Here we are, almost done here. Okay, we're going to talk about this church and state thing. God belongs to church and state. Separation of church and state. Now let's talk about things that exclusively belong to church and things that belong exclusively to state. And then there are lots of other areas of human endeavor that are not church and are not state. Okay, things that only belong to the church. Religious doctrine, symbols and rites, things that they do in that church or a particular church. Ordination and organization of the clergy. That's religious activity. Church membership and excommunication. How do you join? How do you get thrown out? Ecclesiastical laws, including morals, that are imposed on members of the church and on the clergy. They're not imposed on the general public. If you don't belong to a particular religion, you have no obligation to follow the morals of that religion. Now let's look at things that belong exclusively to the state. Criminal and civil laws that are imposed on everyone. Enforcement of civil and criminal laws by armed officers and prosecutors and judges. Operation of military forces. Forcible taking of property, liberty, or even life, hopefully with due process of law. Better be. This is state stuff. And this is church stuff up here. Now, in my opinion, separation of church and state means this. Number one, no church has any of the powers that belong exclusively to the state. The church should not be operating military force. The church should not be forcibly taking property or liberty or life, even with due process of law, from people who aren't members of the church. Number two, go the other way. No state has any of the powers belonging exclusively to the church. The government should not be telling a church who it can have as its ministers, or what its moral laws should be, or who can be a membership, or who can't, or who can go to the church and who can't. The state shouldn't have that power. That's what separation of church and state is about. In fact, there are historic evils to mixing church and state. One of them is deprivation of religious freedom. Suppression of particular religions. This happens when the government gets involved in what religion you have to be. Forcible imposition of atheism and censorship of religious information. Criminal penalties for religious worship. This has gone on in certain parts of the world where atheism became the state religion. Forcible imposition of a particular religion, like illegalized violence by religious fanatics. We see this going on in some parts of the world today. Criminal penalties for refusal to profess belief in a church doctrine. Okay, you have to go to jail. You have to lose your life because you would not profess belief in X. Criminal prosecutions based on intangible spectral evidence. Witch trials. This happened in the United States in 1692 and 1693 in Salem, Massachusetts. People were hung. They were sentenced to death because someone saw an image in their mind of some fantasy that happened. And then that was used as evidence against these people. And that was based on religion, getting the power of the state. In my opinion, the purposes of the two religious clauses in the United States Constitution First Amendment are to prevent these kinds of evils. That's why they're there. And they are not there to prevent harmless references by the state or by public education to religious ideas and symbols that involve no rule and no penalty. Now, let's talk about things that are not exclusively belong to the church or the state. We talked about things exclusively to the church, exclusively to the state, and there's a bunch of other stuff that doesn't fall in either of those categories, like the colors of the rainbow. Does that belong to the church or to the government? The periodic table of the elements. The laws of electricity and magnetism. Moore's law regarding the growth in the number of transistors on a computer chip. Amazing. If you don't know what Moore's law is, you should read about it. These things don't belong to the church, and they don't belong to the government either. They belong to everyone. How about arithmetic, algebra, geometry, the Pythagorean theorem, first order predicate logic? These things don't belong to the church, and they don't belong to the state either. Our mathematical theory of phenomena and causation. Our proof of theorem T3, and God as we have defined it. These don't belong to the church, and they don't belong to the state exclusively. They belong to everything. So, let's talk about God in fundamental U.S. law. In the United States, God is mentioned by various names in most fundamental law. In the Declaration of Independence, 4 times. Nature's God, Creator, Supreme Judge of the world, and Divine Providence. United States Constitution, Year of Our Lord, that's in Article 7. Most state constitutions, in 32 states, they have the word Almighty God, including the California Constitution, the Nevada Constitution. This is in the very first sentence. Look it up. 8 states have the word God without Almighty in front of them. 4 states have Supreme Ruler of the Universe. And there's several other interesting ones in some of the state constitutions. Now, many atheists want these references to be removed from the law on the grounds of separation of church and state. But the G-proof refutes this. God is just as much a matter of state as of church and of all other fields of human activity. Let's talk about the impact of math and science and technology on the law. You know, as math and science and technology develop, new challenges cause references to them to appear in the law, like the electromagnetic spectrum. You know, in 1850, there were no laws about the electromagnetic spectrum, but when radio was invented, then there came a whole issue of, well, who owns what part of the spectrum to broadcast on? And a bunch of laws arose to deal with that. Motor vehicles. Back in the days of horses and buggies, there wasn't a whole lot of problem with, I mean, I'm sure there were some problems, but not like when we have motor vehicles, we have huge bodies of law regulating that, licensing and where you have to drive and all that kind of stuff. Medicine. As medicine has evolved, it's become more powerful, and so there are laws about that. Dangerous chemicals. There are laws about these things. Explosives. Elevator design and maintenance. I don't want to get into an elevator unless I can see that, well, somebody's making sure the thing is maintained properly. Computer systems. Even computer systems are moving in that direction now. With the internet requires some government regulation, just in terms of who gets what domain name. So the separation of church and state is not offended by any of this. And likewise, separation of church and state is not offended by the law mentioning God. The G-proof has exonerated God from claims by atheists and others that God belongs exclusively to the church. God exists as a matter of pure mathematics. Science must now develop by taking God into consideration. And since psychology, education, and the law are free to reference mathematics and science and technology, those fields are likewise free to reference God, including public education. There is no breach of the separation of church and state by the law or government or public education referencing God. And in my opinion, law and government should now develop in accordance with the existence of G. Okay, so that takes care of our this big box here about religion, psychology, education, law, and government. That's done. That's science. We've got one more to go here. Upping Pascal's wager. We're almost done with the 9 videos. Okay, here we go. Wonder Innocence and Upping Pascal's wager. Here we are. Last item on the last outline. Wonder. How does God cause everything? On top of that, God has created itself. How? Or in version 2, perhaps, God just exists without having been caused, but I still have to ask the question, how? You know, evidently God has generated, I'm going to change the word to, I'm going to say generated. I'll see why in a second. God has generated itself and everything else, and God continues to operate everything, and when things are destroyed, God destroys them. So, look at this. God, G-O-D, generator, operator, destroyer. Isn't that interesting? This is amazingly awesome. Pondering all of these facts should bring every mentally competent person into a state of wonder. Wow. And in my opinion, it's a good thing. It's a good thing to be in a place of wonder. It's like, wow, that's good. Now what about innocence? How and why does God do what God does? In my opinion, the only response to this question is, I don't know. And not an arrogant or a sad, I don't know, or I don't know, but an enlightened, joyous, I don't know. And this brings us back to childlike innocence. An enlightened innocence, when we don't know, and we really don't know. You see, with the power of mathematics, we now know that God exists, and yet we are completely clueless how it all works. So wonder and innocence, in my opinion, are good medicine for the diseases of arrogance and stubborn ego. Wonder and innocence bring a healthy humility and a lightness of heart. So in my opinion, if we want to resolve the colossal problems facing this world today, we need to install leaders who are not only brilliant, honest, inspiring visionaries, but who also live in wonder and innocence, and who believe in God. So now, let's talk about Pascal's wager. Blaise Pascal, he lived back in the 1600s, he famously stated, "There is more to be gained from wagering on the existence of God than from atheism. Hence, a rational person should live as though God exists, even though the truth of the matter cannot actually be known." And so that was his wager. He decided to bet his life, to wager his life on as if God exists, even though he wasn't sure God existed, because he thought it was a better thing to do. That's Pascal's wager. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to up Pascal's wager now. Okay? We have now proven that God does exist, which gets beyond where Pascal was stuck. But we have not yet proven whether God answers prayers. Prayer is not a part of G theory. We don't know. Does God answer prayers? We haven't proven that. And so now I'm going to up Pascal's wager, just in case God does answer prayers. Here we go. God bless you. God bless all of humanity. And God bless this entire planet. So here we are. That's it. That's the end of video 9. We've got all cyan color here on our map now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'm Mark Lawrence Donald Emerson.